Hey guys, tonight we step back into a time when marriage wasn't about candlelit dinners or romantic getaways, but about contracts, alliances, and occasionally, a bit of public bargaining. Picture yourself standing in a bustling medieval town square, surrounded by the clatter of wooden carts and the chatter of merchants hawking their wares, not goods, but brides. It might sound like a strange scene to your modern ears, but you probably won't survive a day in this market if you think love is the main currency here. Families arranged marriages like business deals, weighing social status and property more than feelings. This was a world where a daughter's future was negotiated like a prized goat or a sack of grain. You hear the murmurs of parents and local lords, the shuffle of papers and coin, and the occasional nervous laughter from girls trying to hide behind their veils. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments so I can say hi wherever you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dusty lanes of medieval Europe, stepping into a world where marriages are less about romance and more about strategy. Here, families viewed daughters as important pieces in a larger game of alliances and wealth. The idea of marrying for love? That was a luxury mostly reserved for poets and troubadours, not for the majority who needed to secure their futures. Marriage was essentially a business transaction, and like any business, there were markets for it. These weren't secretive affairs behind closed doors, but public negotiations sometimes taking place in village squares or during local fairs. Fathers, uncles, and sometimes village elders acted like brokers, discussing dowries, property rights, and social connections like traders weighing the value of their goods. Imagine the cobbled square filled with townsfolk bustling between market stalls, but instead of apples or cloth, there's a different kind of commerce going on. A wealthy father adjusts his cloak, eyeing a potential suitor inspecting his daughter's embroidery skills, while nearby, another family argues over the value of a promised dowry. It's a scene filled with cautious glances, whispered deals, and the occasional hesitant smile from a girl barely old enough to understand the weight of these transactions. The earliest marriages often took place soon after puberty, when girls transitioned from childhood into their new social role. Their futures were bargained over, often long before they fully understood what was happening. You might imagine a scene where a father proudly lists his daughter's virtues, from her spinning skills to her family's landholdings, while potential suitors appraise the offerings with a mix of practicality and greed. Dowries, the sum of money, goods, or land a bride's family provided, were often the centerpiece of these deals. Sometimes these dowries included household goods, jewelry, or even livestock. The dowry was like a starter kit for married life, but also a symbol of the family's status and generosity. The larger the dowry, the more attractive the bride became in this marketplace. It wasn't just the bride's family who had something to negotiate, the groom's family also had stakes in the arrangement. Marriages served as strategic alliances, creating bonds between families that could help with political influence, military support, or economic partnerships. You can almost hear the measured voices debating who would gain more from the union, weighing the long-term benefits against the immediate costs. Interestingly, historians still argue whether this business-like approach completely ruled out personal feelings or if some genuine affection sometimes sneaked in amidst the negotiations. There's evidence that while most marriages were strategic, small moments of tenderness or personal choice weren't unheard of, though definitely not the norm. Love stories from the medieval period are rare but cherished precisely because they break the usual mold of calculated matches. You might picture a rare scene where a young couple, bound by contract but also by secret admiration, shares a quiet glance during a noisy feast. Or perhaps a matchmaker gently nudges a shy bride-to-be toward her new husband, offering a wink and a knowing smile. These moments hint that even in a market-driven system, human emotion found a way to bloom, however modestly. In any case, it's clear that in this medieval marketplace, your value as a bride was tied to your family's wealth and status, and your own skills in managing a household. Unlike today, where you might swipe left or right, the choices here were often made by those holding the purse strings. Your skills mattered, too. Spinning wool, cooking, managing servants, and keeping accounts were highly prized talents. A bride who could run a household efficiently was like a well-oiled machine, essential for maintaining a family's prosperity and reputation. You can almost hear the approving murmurs of relatives recounting her expertise, making her a more desirable candidate for marriage. And don't forget the regional variations. In some areas, girls could be married as young as 12 or 13. Elsewhere, they might wait until their mid-teens or even early 20s. The timing depended on local customs, family needs, and sometimes sheer luck. The medieval world wasn't uniform. Each town, village, or lordship had its own peculiar rules and rituals, adding spice to the marketplace's everyday drama. The market wasn't just a place for transactions but also a social event. It was common for community members to gather, watch, and gossip about prospective matches. You can almost feel the curious eyes sizing up brides and grooms alike, the whispered rumors about a family's declining fortunes, or the hopeful chatter about a wealthy suitor arriving from a distant town. The atmosphere was a curious blend of tension and normalcy, a public reminder that marriage was a communal affair, entwined with honor and duty. And while the girls and boys involved might have felt overwhelmed, this public aspect gave the whole process a sense of legitimacy and shared responsibility. You might chuckle at the thought that, unlike the modern romantic dinner, the medieval marriage market involved haggling, paperwork, and the occasional awkward moment when a father tried to sweeten the deal by offering an extra cow or a barrel of ale. So, as you picture the sun warming the cobblestones and the sound of a distant lute mixing with merchants' calls, remember, this was the world where marriage markets thrived, a world as pragmatic as it was peculiar. Love, if it appeared at all, was an unexpected guest, not the host. By understanding this, you begin to see medieval marriages not as cold contracts but as vital social mechanisms, woven deeply into the fabric of daily life. It's a world where you learn that alliances, economics, and survival often took precedence over heartstrings, a world that feels strange, yet oddly familiar in its complexity. You follow the faint, earthy aroma of roasting chestnuts mingled with the sharp, musky scent of horse sweat as you wander deeper into the medieval marriage marketplace. The crowd's clamor swells around you, merchants shouting prices, children darting between stalls, the clatter of wooden wheels over cobblestones. Yet just beyond the din, you notice a different kind of negotiation unfolding, quieter but no less intense. This is where parents step into the spotlight, not as passive observers but as the real players, seasoned merchants of their children's futures, masters of an intricate social trade. Picture them standing just out of the bustling crowd, their eyes sharp and calculating. They aren't here for friendly chit-chat or to casually meet potential sons or daughters-in-law. Instead, they appraise each candidate as if evaluating prized livestock at a fair, studying stature, lineage, wealth, and reputation. Every glance, every whispered comment carries the weight of a family's hopes, fears, and ambitions. These parents aren't simply concerned with their child's happiness, though, in rare and ideal cases, some might have cared. No, their primary goal was securing or improving the family's standing within a rigid social order. Every marriage deal struck here had consequences far beyond the immediate union. Property lines shifted, political alliances were forged or broken, and sometimes peace or tension between local clans hinged on these carefully brokered matches. You can almost hear the low murmurs of these negotiations drifting through the air, sometimes stretching over days or even weeks. Parents compare the benefits and drawbacks of each candidate in hushed voices, weighing the size of dowries against the prestige of noble titles, or the promise of fertile land against the reliability of an established family name. Visualize a mother bent over her daughter's embroidery work, her eyes scanning every stitch with the precision of an art critic. Yes, skills like sewing and needlework were more than just hobbies. They were vital proof of a girl's suitability as a future wife. A finely embroidered hem could speak volumes about a family's status and the daughter's readiness to manage a household. Meanwhile, just a few steps away, the father engages in a serious discussion with the potential groom's family, poring over land deeds, livestock inventories, and past debts like a shrewd businessman negotiating a multi-year contract. These were not casual social encounters but strategic meetings, with parents taking on roles far more intense than today's harmless, "let me set you up" texts. It's easy to imagine the pressure in the air, the delicate dance of diplomacy, as families maneuvered to maximize advantages while avoiding offense or scandal. Interestingly, historians still debate how much say children had in these family bargains. While parents held ultimate control, after all, marriages were investments in a family's future rather than romantic partnerships. There is evidence that girls sometimes exerted influence through subtle actions. A refusal to cooperate, quiet protests, or veiled disapproval could signal resistance without outright rebellion. But such defiance was risky. Families depended heavily on these marriages for social and economic stability, so the stakes were high. It's also worth noting that this broker role wasn't limited to parents alone. Extended family members often played significant parts: uncles, aunts, cousins with vested interests, along with local lords and community elders. Each brought their own stakes and agendas, turning the marriage market into a complex social web. Family honor, wealth, and influence weren't just abstract concepts. They were bargaining chips placed on a crowded, ever-shifting table. You might chuckle at the thought that these medieval parents were, in a way, early venture capitalists, investing heavily in their daughters with hopes of high returns in social capital, security, and stability. But unlike modern venture capitalists with spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides, the product, your future spouse, wasn't up for a live pitch. Instead, reputation, connections, and sometimes a bit of good luck sealed the deal. Imagine, for a moment, a family council gathered in a dimly lit room after the marketplace noise has faded. The adults weigh offers, debate terms, and strategize, balancing hope with pragmatism. For some, The right match might mean climbing a rung on the social ladder. For others, it could be about preserving fragile alliances or even preventing conflict. The negotiations are as much about survival as they are about prosperity. And yet, amidst all this heavy business, there's an undeniable human warmth beneath the surface. The hopes parents have for their children's futures, the pride in presenting a daughter or son as the best possible match, and the quiet, hopeful dreams that maybe this union will bring happiness along with advantage. As you let the sounds of the marketplace recede, keep in mind, behind every marriage offer was a family strategy session, a mini council of elders, and a delicate balance of hope, pragmatism, and, sometimes, a touch of gentle stubbornness. This marketplace wasn't just about contracts or dowries, it was about weaving the fabric of community, legacy, and life itself. You drift toward the heart of the bustling marketplace, where colorful tents flap lazily in the breeze and the hum of voices blends with the occasional clatter of wooden stools and the soft neighing of horses tethered nearby. This isn't just any fair. You can tell instantly that this is where medieval marriage markets come alive, a curious mixture of festivity, negotiation, and quiet tension that feels part carnival, part business expo. The scent of hay mingles with smoke from cooking fires, while strings of lanterns promise warm light after dusk. It's a scene buzzing with energy yet somehow oddly measured, as if everyone here is part actor and part spectator in a carefully choreographed dance. Families gather from miles around, bringing daughters dressed in their finest gowns, embroidered with care and bedecked with ribbons, brooches, or simple strands of beads, each young woman arranged as if on display, like prized wares in a shop window. Imagine stalls decorated with colorful tapestries hanging from wooden frames, fragrant bundles of herbs suspended overhead, and tables lined with intricate lacework, freshly spun wool, or polished wooden bowls. It's like a slow-motion parade where every glance exchanged, every carefully folded hand, and every shy smile is loaded with unspoken meaning, a subtle language understood by everyone except the occasional wide-eyed outsider. Nearby, merchants shout over the din to hawk their goods, clay pots, iron tools, or fragrant spices, but here, the main currency isn't coins or trade goods. It's social capital, the delicate art of matchmaking where a family's reputation, the skills of a daughter, and the size of her dowry all weigh heavily. Brides are often showcased much like prized animals or artisan crafts, their virtues announced aloud. This one is skilled with needle and thread, and comes with a dowry of fine linens, or, a quick learner and steady with livestock, her family holds lands by the river. The atmosphere is noisy but polite, a strange mix of excitement and awkwardness, as people whisper, nudge each other, and point discreetly while sizing up prospects. Interestingly, some of these marriage markets included public auctions, though not the dramatic, shouting affairs you might imagine from movies. Instead of clamoring over prices, families sometimes offered dowries or bride prices openly, inviting potential grooms or their representatives to make their intentions known. Imagine a father carefully presenting a modest but respectable chest of coins or promising a parcel of fertile land, while other families nod in approval or politely decline. The whole scene balances precariously between celebration and serious deal-making, a paradox that must have been confusing, even unsettling, for the girls caught squarely in the middle. Historians still argue about the exact nature of these gatherings. Were they primarily social events aimed at community bonding and celebration, Or did the economic exchange overshadow everything else? The evidence suggests both. Certainly, the marriage market functioned as a crucial social hub, offering rare chances for families from distant villages or regions to meet, exchange news, and even enjoy music, dancing, and hearty meals together. Bards might strum lutes while children darted between tents, and the smell of roasting meat mingled with fresh bread and wildflowers. But beneath this festive veneer lurked the sober reality of futures being traded, young lives negotiated as carefully as wool or grain, with stakes as high as a family's fortune or honor. You might picture a little girl, perhaps no older than 10 or 12, tucked behind a stall, wide-eyed and nervous, watching the scene unfold like a complicated play. Her heart pounds as she hears whispers, catches glances from potential suitors, and feels the weight of unspoken expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She probably understands more than she lets on, the hushed judgments, the quiet calculations, and wonders if she will ever have a say in her own future. Nearby, a weary father leans on a wooden post, bargaining late into the evening by the flickering glow of lanterns, counting coins and weighing risks like a merchant balancing ledgers. Every choice feels momentous, every handshake a promise or a gamble. The marketplace is alive with sensory detail. You hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance, the rhythmic pounding like a heartbeat underpinning the chatter. The air carries the scent of fresh bread, sweet apples, and smoky firewood, while the cool breeze rustles the canvas tents and stirs loose straw underfoot. Occasionally, a horse neighs softly, adding to the tapestry of sounds. It's a place where commerce meets ceremony, where deals are struck amidst laughter and whispers, where futures are decided and lives forever altered. Even in the midst of the ritual and negotiation, moments of quiet humanity slip through. You might catch a fleeting glance between a young woman and a hopeful suitor, their eyes locking with a mix of curiosity, hope, or perhaps resigned acceptance. Or notice an older woman discreetly adjusting a ribbon on a nervous girl's sleeve, offering a comforting smile or whispered advice. These brief, tender interactions remind you that beneath the formalities and customs, real people lived, dreamed, and sometimes even loved. There's also a curious blend of tradition and pragmatism. Some families might emphasize lineage and land ownership. Others focus on practical skills, like managing a household or tending animals. Dowries were carefully weighed, but so were character traits and family alliances. Some girls were valued for their knowledge of herbal remedies or weaving, others for their ability to charm and entertain. This mix of attributes, both tangible and intangible, shaped the market's rhythm and mood. You might find it oddly comforting, or perhaps a bit unnerving, that, despite the centuries and the distance, this marketplace felt remarkably familiar. The nervousness of first meetings, the awkwardness of introductions, the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this exchange could lead to something more than a contract. Historians still debate whether these gatherings were more about love slowly growing after marriage or strictly about duty and alliance. Either way, the medieval marriage market was a stage where centuries of human experience played out with all its complexities and contradictions. So as you wander through this vibrant market scene in your mind, take in the sights, sounds, and smells. Feel the blend of excitement and anxiety, the mix of celebration and negotiation. Remember that behind every folded hand and whispered conversation was a life poised on the cusp of change, where hope and pragmatism danced in equal measure, crafting futures one careful step at a time. You linger near a worn wooden table, its surface cluttered with faded parchments, scattered coins, and scraps of parchment dotted with hastily scrawled figures. The air here hums softly with the murmur of measured voices discussing dowries and bride prices, the twin financial threads that wove families together in the medieval marriage market. Unlike today, where the very idea of buying a partner feels uncomfortable or wrong, in this world, these exchanges weren't about commodifying people. Instead, they acted as essential parts of a carefully balanced contract, silent agreements that could ensure survival, honor, and stability for all involved. Imagine the dowry first. This was typically the wealth a bride brought to her new household, sometimes land, livestock, jewelry, fine linens, or simply coins tucked away in a small chest. It was far more than a gift. The dowry acted as a kind of economic cushion, a foundation to help the newlyweds start their life together on solid ground. Families invested years in assembling these bundles of wealth, hoping to offer their daughter a tangible stake in her future. More than just money or goods, it was a promise of security. In some cases, the dowry served as an insurance policy for the bride herself, something she might reclaim if the marriage ended prematurely or if her husband passed away, providing a rare measure of financial independence in a largely male-dominated world. Now, shift your gaze to the bride price, a related but distinct concept. Unlike the dowry, which moved from the bride's family to the groom's, the bride price was paid by the groom or his family to the bride's family. Think of it as compensation for the loss of a valuable family member, someone whose labor, presence, and social contribution would be dearly missed. This was especially true in agrarian communities where daughters helped with farming, childcare, and household tasks. The exact amount and form of this payment varied widely, sometimes in coins, other times in livestock, or even precious goods like fine cloth or tools. Picture the scene. A stern, calculating father counts silver coins carefully, negotiating hard to secure a bride price that reflects not just his daughter's beauty, but her health, fertility, and reputation. It wasn't a matter of simple economics. Social connections, the potential for fruitful alliances, and even gossip about character all influenced the valuation. Sometimes the bride price was purely symbolic, a modest token of goodwill. In other cases, it could equal a small fortune, especially if the bride came from a powerful family or brought with her the promise of advantageous political ties. But the financial arrangements surrounding marriage weren't uniform. Some medieval cultures reversed these roles or did away with the bride price altogether. Historians still debate what this means about shifting power dynamics between genders and families. Was a lack of bride price a sign of greater female autonomy? Or did it reflect different social priorities and traditions? The answers vary, tangled in local laws, customs, and family strategies, each community scripting its own version of how marriage's economic dance should unfold. In some regions, the dowry was so substantial it functioned almost like a bride's inheritance, a quiet form of empowerment. For example, a well-endowed dowry might include lands that passed to the bride in her own right, allowing her a say in their management or even giving her financial clout if she became widowed. This subtle empowerment stood out in a society where women's legal rights were often limited. Conversely, in other areas, the dowry was more like a starter pack, intended to be spent quickly on household necessities, pots, pans, linens, and food stores for the new home. Meanwhile, the bride price underscored the idea that women were valued assets, integral to the family's social standing and wealth. This valuation might feel transactional to modern ears, but it made sense in a world where family labor and alliances were survival strategies. You might smile picturing a nervous young groom clutching his purse, silently calculating whether he could pay the bride price without parting with his best horse, his pride and a valuable asset on the battlefield or farm. And then there's the mother, fussing over the size and contents of her daughter's dowry like a sharp merchant eyeing profit margins. The stakes felt high, not just for family honor but for real economic survival. The dowry's size could affect marriage prospects dramatically, making some families scramble to gather goods or negotiate terms to keep their daughter's future secure. All these financial exchanges, dowries, bride prices, and everything in between, formed the invisible backbone of medieval marriage markets. They were not merely transactions but complex negotiations layered with tradition, obligation, and social expectation. This economic choreography ensured that marriages served not only as personal unions but as strategic alliances, balancing love, duty, and survival in equal measure. So as you sit beside that wooden table, listening to these hushed talks and watching hands exchange coins and contracts, you realize that the medieval marriage market was less about buying a person and more about securing futures, crafting social bonds, and weaving families together with threads of trust and mutual interest. It was a marketplace not just of goods, but of hopes and promises, where each coin and gift carried weight beyond its mere material value. You wake slowly with the dawn, soft light brushing the modest wooden walls of a village home. Outside, birds begin their tentative songs while the world stretches awake in pale streaks of morning. Inside, a young girl stirs, her day about to begin, not with school bells or playdates, but with a steady routine designed to prepare her for a future few modern ears could easily grasp. In the medieval world, childhood was not the carefree season you might imagine. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate march toward a role defined by society's expectations, that of a wife, a homemaker, and a keeper of family honor. Before the clamor of the marketplace, before the signing of contracts and the weighing of dowries, girls lived in a world where every chore, every lesson, was a brick laid on the path toward marriage. You can almost hear the faint hum of a spinning wheel in a corner, the rhythmic creak as a mother or grandmother turns the wheel with practiced ease. The girl sits nearby, her small fingers learning to twist flax into thread, the raw, slightly rough fibers slipping and tugging between her fingertips. This was not just an exercise in patience or skill, it was an essential task, weaving the fabric of future household prosperity. The scent of freshly baked rye bread drifts from the hearth, warm and comforting. You can picture her carefully watching the flames, learning when to pull the bread from the oven just before it's too dark or too pale. This daily bread was a cornerstone of sustenance, and knowing how to prepare it well was a key part of her education. Managing animals was also part of the lesson plan if the family kept livestock, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, or helping with the cattle. These were not mere chores but crucial training in responsibility and service. Each task was a small step in a long preparation to keep a household running smoothly. The quiet rhythm of these days, with its gentle repetition, might seem dull or restrictive to us now, but for a medieval girl, it was the foundation of her identity. Every stitch, every loaf, Every chore was a brick in the sturdy house she would one day build with her own hands. Yet, not all girls' lessons were confined to the hearth. In noble families, daughters received an education that might include etiquette, music, and basic literacy, a curriculum meant to polish them for life in courtly circles. They practiced graceful curtsies, learned to read simple texts, and sometimes played the lute or harp to charm future suitors. This kind of education was a double-edged sword, empowering in some ways, yet also another form of grooming for their predetermined social roles. Historians still argue whether such instruction truly broadened their horizons or merely reinforced the roles they were expected to fill. Social gatherings for girls were rare, but when they happened, they held special significance. At these quiet events, girls observed the older women, absorbing stories and family histories like seeds planted for future understanding. They learned about alliances, rivalries, and the unspoken codes that governed status and behavior. These gatherings were subtle rehearsals for the world they would soon enter, a world where family reputation and social standing mattered deeply. You might smile imagining a young girl stealing moments to try on her mother's best dress, feeling the heavy fabric slide over her arms and imagining herself transformed. Or picture her practicing a curtsy in front of a cracked mirror, trying to master the perfect balance of respect and grace. These private rehearsals were both a balm and a preparation, a space where dreams tangled with duty. Sometimes, girls formed secret alliances, small circles of trust and understanding to share whispered hopes or coded messages. These friendships could be lifelines, offering comfort in a world where much was dictated by others. And all the while, looming in the background like a shadow at the edge of a dream, was the marketplace itself, the place where futures would be decided, where families bartered and arranged matches, where childhood would give way to the wider, often harsher realities of marital alliances. That web of lessons, whispered stories, and quiet preparation threads through the noise of the market to come. It shapes the unfolding drama of marriages arranged, dowries weighed, and lives exchanged. This early education was not just about skills but about survival, knowing how to navigate a world that expected girls to become more than themselves, to become symbols of family hopes and economic strategy. So, as the girl moves through her morning, practicing the old crafts, you see the invisible scaffolding supporting her journey. Each spindle spun, each loaf baked, each whispered story heard, all add up to a future shaped long before the marketplace doors swing open. In this gentle, repetitive rhythm, the medieval girl readies herself, not just to survive, but to fulfill the delicate, complex role awaiting her. It's a slow transformation, almost imperceptible, where childhood's soft edges give way to the firm outlines of adult obligation. And though it's a world far removed from our own, its quiet intensity lingers, a reminder of how deeply human the journey from child to bride has always been. You step into the heart of the marketplace, but it's not just families haggling over dowries or parents boasting about their children's virtues. There's a whole shadow economy humming quietly beneath the surface, matchmakers, brokers, and go-betweens weaving invisible threads that bind futures together. Picture them as the backstage diplomats of medieval matrimony, armed with an arsenal of gossip, keen connections, and a finely tuned talent for negotiation. These middlemen weren't just the social butterflies flitting about the market. Some were full-time professionals, making a living by pairing the right families like a medieval version of a dating app. If the app involved a lot more handshakes, whispered conversations behind veiled curtains, and an uncanny ability to read a dowry's real value beyond the obvious coin. Others were relatives or trusted friends, people who knew the tangled family trees, the scandals politely buried, and the subtle social cues that could either smooth or shatter a deal. Imagine spotting one of these matchmakers across a bustling market square. She exchanges a quick nod with a father intent on selling his daughter's hand, slips a few carefully chosen words about a prospective groom's virtues, and moves on with a smile that hides more calculation than casual kindness. Sometimes, she dangles a compliment that barely conceals a veiled critique of a dowry, delicately balancing praise and pragmatism in the same breath. Their influence went far beyond mere introductions. Matchmakers often acted as emotional shock absorbers in a marketplace that could otherwise be brutally transactional. Instead of a blunt rejection that might stain reputations or cause lasting offense, a matchmaker would cushion the blow. "We'll consider it," or "perhaps another time," phrases designed to maintain dignity and keep negotiations alive. This politeness was essential in a world where social standing hinged on appearances and where a declined proposal wasn't just a no, but a potential family slight. You might find it amusing that not all matchmakers had purely benevolent reputations. Some were known as matchbreakers, quietly sabotaging unions that didn't benefit their own interests or alliances. Perhaps they had loyalties to one family or a personal grudge, or maybe a hidden agenda to secure a better deal elsewhere. This added a dash of intrigue and suspense to what might otherwise have been a straightforward, if somewhat dry, business of arranging marriages. Historians still debate how much sway these go-betweens really wielded. Were they the puppet masters pulling the strings of medieval society's most intimate alliances, or were they humble facilitators navigating a rigid and predetermined system? The answer is probably a mix of both, shaped by local customs, wealth, and politics. Imagine the soft shuffle of parchment contracts, whispered names carried on the breeze, and secret hand signals exchanged in shadowed corners, all under the watchful eyes of anxious families eager to secure the best possible matches. Information was currency here, and a well-placed word, a carefully timed rumor, or a subtly leaked detail could tip the scales from acceptance to rejection, prosperity to hardship. You might picture a matchmaker's toolkit, a sharp mind for genealogy, a Rolodex of family connections, if they had such a thing, and a talent for spinning stories that highlighted a prospective bride's modesty or a groom's industriousness while gently concealing less desirable traits. There was a kind of theatrical finesse in their work, blending diplomacy, psychology, and a pinch of performance. Sometimes, matchmakers worked across borders, bridging cultures and languages to arrange unions that strengthened alliances or expanded trade networks. Their role was not just social but political and economic, linking families in webs that could influence everything from local peace to regional power dynamics. It's easy to think of modern matchmaking as a new invention, speed dating apps, online profiles, blind dates. But the medieval marketplace was its own intricate ecosystem of matchmakers, juggling social pressures and personal desires with skill and subtlety. These go-betweens were part diplomat, part family counselor, and part gossip queen, balancing delicate egos and delicate contracts with equal care. So next time you hear about a professional matchmaker or a family friend trying to set you up, remember these medieval intermediaries. Their world was slower, their currency less digital, but their mission the same: to smooth the edges of human relationships, making the complicated business of marriage just a little easier to navigate. You find yourself amid a gentle swirl of gossip and glances as the conversation drifts to the bride herself, her role more complex than just a passive prize in this medieval market. The scent of herbs drifts from the nearby stalls, the clink of coins softens in the background, and your ears perk as old women whisper over bolts of linen, while a gaggle of younger girls pretends not to listen too closely. In this space, the bride isn't simply handed off like property. She's observed, assessed, sometimes admired, and occasionally feared. While it might seem, on the surface, that girls were mere commodities in this social exchange, appraised for beauty, chastity, and family name, the reality is layered. Many brides, despite their young age and legally constrained position, found subtle ways to exert influence and navigate the world being constructed around them. These were not always grand gestures. No storming from rooms or tearful protests. Instead, their resistance was quiet, strategic, and often encoded in social language. A lowered gaze, a delayed response, a well-timed compliment to the right person. Imagine a young woman standing beside her mother at the market, fingers folded neatly in front of her, as a prospective suitor's family passes by. There's a flicker of a frown when their backs are turned. A barely perceptible tilt of the head that only her mother catches. Maybe the mother says nothing but adjusts her plans accordingly. This is influence, not in grand, sweeping strokes, but in careful brushwork. You might be surprised to know that historians still debate how much real choice girls had in their marriages. In wealthier circles, political alliances often took precedence over personal feelings, and matches were made with a cold, economic efficiency. Among the peasantry, marriages were more localized and less politically entangled, but not necessarily more voluntary. Still, recorded instances of girls refusing matches, or even eloping with preferred partners, suggest that not all brides were as powerless as they appear in textbooks. Sometimes, resistance came in more creative forms. A bride-to-be might subtly sabotage a match by feigning illness, or by acting deliberately uncharming during a suitor's visit. There are even scattered tales of young women disguising themselves to avoid an undesired marriage, though these stories walk the hazy line between fact and folklore. What they do show is a desire to be seen not merely as objects, but as individuals with will and wit. And then there was charm. Oh yes, charm. A well-placed compliment, a clever joke, or a moment of unexpected competence could sway a household's opinion. You can imagine a potential bride winning over her future in-laws with a gentle, knowing smile, or by managing to bake something delightful while pretending it was nothing special. Social grace was a powerful currency, and those who wielded it skillfully could influence the tide of negotiations in their favor. Reputation played an enormous role too. A girl's virtue, of course, was scrutinized, measured in layers of metaphorical white cloth and delicate silence. But just as important were the whispered tales of her kindness, her skill with herbs, her way with animals, or how she handled small children. A girl known to be generous with the poor or respectful to elders could elevate her social value even if her dowry was modest. Gossip, once it started, traveled fast, by medieval standards at least. A single comment from a merchant's wife might drift from one hearth to another until it shaped the perception of an entire village. You might chuckle imagining how quickly a tale could twist. A girl seen walking with a boy too late in the day? It might be an innocent visit to the well, or it might become, in retelling, a scandalous moonlight rendezvous. And just like that, one family's match could dissolve overnight. Family dynamics, of course, were crucial in all this. A bride's mother, grandmother, or older sisters often played a behind-the-scenes role, coaching her in how to respond during suitor visits, what questions to ask without seeming impolite, and how to present herself with the right balance of humility and appeal. You might imagine them gathered in the kitchen at dusk, voices low, practicing polite refusals and calculated curiosity as if preparing for a play. And in some families, though not many, a daughter's assertiveness was quietly encouraged. Not for rebellion's sake, but as a sign of inner strength. A girl who could speak clearly, articulate a thought, or hold eye contact might be considered valuable not just as a wife, but as a future household manager, one capable of keeping servants in order or handling estate matters in her husband's absence. This brings you to one of the more curious features of the medieval marriage market: arranged love. That's right, love of a kind. While the initial match might come from negotiation or necessity, couples did sometimes grow genuinely fond of each other. Some historians argue that mutual affection was more common than we assume, particularly when matches were made within tight-knit communities where individuals already knew one another. Childhood friends sometimes became spouses. Matches arranged by thoughtful family members could yield decades of contentment and even tenderness. There are letters, tender, awkward, often sweet, that survive from this era, written between husbands and wives expressing care, longing, and gratitude. You might be surprised by how contemporary their voices sound. One man calls his wife, "the joy of my household." Another woman writes to her husband while he's away on business, begging him to stay safe and to bring back warm wool for the children. These little glimpses show that affection didn't always begin the marriage, but it often found a place within it. Still, many brides found themselves walking into completely unknown situations. You can picture one stepping across the threshold of a new household, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of foreign herbs, trying to recall the name of her new father-in-law. The wedding might have been celebrated, but the true work began the day after: the slow building of relationships, respect, and routine. And through all of it, you might quietly admire these young women's resilience. For every story of forced marriage and lost autonomy, there are stories of adaptation, subtle power, and unexpected triumphs. Some managed households with a level of efficiency that commanded admiration. Others became matriarchs in their own right, shaping not just the next generation but the moral backbone of entire communities. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to ask and when to hint, how to build influence without stepping too far beyond what society permitted. In a world that often sought to define them strictly by family business, many brides found clever, courageous ways to define themselves. So as you drift past these murmuring corners of the medieval marriage market, take a moment to listen not just to the official deals being struck, but to the softer, hidden negotiations that shaped just as much of the outcome. The bride was rarely just a prize. More often, she was a player, making quiet moves on a well-worn board. The conversation now drifts to the unexpected roles gender and social class played in these markets, where marriage negotiations differed vastly depending on your rank, and not just between nobles and peasants, but even within families. You're struck by the thought that while wealth often dictated the terms, sometimes a clever strategy could bend those rules in surprising ways. You begin to picture it clearly: a young peasant girl, hair plaited neatly, hands rough from work in the fields, sitting quietly while her parents discuss her future over a mug of weak ale. There's no grandeur here, no elaborate feasts or scrolls of lineage, just a family trying to make the best deal they can for their daughter. Her dowry might be little more than a pair of geese and a spinning wheel, and her marriage would likely be arranged early to ease the burden on the household. But just a few miles away, behind the high stone walls of a noble estate, the situation unfolds quite differently. A baron's daughter, cloistered in fine linens, studies a letter by candlelight. It's from her aunt, suggesting a match with the son of a neighboring lord. The timing must be perfect. Her family might delay the union until that boy comes of age or until the political winds shift in their favor. Her marriage is a strategic move, a game piece in a larger power play. Her worth is calculated in acres, bloodlines, and alliances. And yet, despite these chasms in lifestyle, some things are oddly consistent. No matter the class, a girl was expected to bring skills into the marriage. For peasant girls, it was practical abilities: milking, baking, weaving, child-rearing. For nobles, it might be more refined: managing a household of servants, reading ledgers, embroidery. But still, work was work. A competent bride made for a stable home, whether that home had a thatched roof or a turret. Historians still argue about how much agency women of different classes actually had in these arrangements. In many noble families, daughters might have had more indirect influence than you'd expect. A young lady with a quick wit and a talent for diplomacy might nudge her father toward a more favorable match, or delay an undesirable one by feigning illness or religious calling. And once married, some noble women wielded real power, managing estates during their husbands' absences, overseeing servants, even serving as regents for underage sons. Their influence wasn't always written into law, but it flowed through the household like water through pipes, quiet but essential. Peasant women, meanwhile, might not rule over lands, but they were often the managers of the family's immediate survival. They determined how far the flour stretched, when to patch a leaking roof, and who owed whom for borrowed tools or seed. A clever peasant woman could shape her household's fortunes just as decisively as a noble woman might shift a court alliance. Still, marriage negotiations often boiled down to harsh math. A noble's son might reject a merchant's daughter, even if she came with chests of silver, simply because her blood wasn't clean enough. Birth trumped coin in many circles. And yet, some merchant families were persistent. You might smile, imagining a determined father polishing his daughter's manners until they gleamed like his counting tables, hoping to marry her up into nobility and soften the edge of his family's new money. Sometimes it worked. A particularly strategic match, perhaps between a financially strained noble and a wealthy commoner, could open doors that once seemed nailed shut. But social climbing wasn't easy, and ridicule often followed those who dared to try. Aristocratic mothers might roll their eyes at a merchant's daughter's table manners, even as they pocketed her silks and spices. You can almost hear the snide whispering across the table, "She stirs her broth clockwise." Can you imagine? Yet contradictions abounded. A well-born girl from a financially ruined family might find herself passed over for marriage altogether, her noble blood no match for her empty purse. Meanwhile, a peasant girl with an impressive set of household skills could secure a surprisingly favorable marriage, moving up a social rung or two, enough to catch the envy of her neighbors and the suspicion of her new kin. Even within families, class and gender tangled like threads in a tapestry. Sons were expected to marry down less often than daughters were expected to marry up. A nobleman might take a commoner as a mistress, but rarely as a wife. Daughters were bargaining chips, pawns played carefully and with long-term strategy in mind. Some parents were stern, others sympathetic, but few left these decisions entirely to their children. You might smirk, imagining a noble girl secretly pining for a handsome stable boy, while her parents discussed dowries with a dull baronet from 3 counties over. Or a merchant's daughter, practicing embroidery by candlelight, dreaming of silk gowns she'd never afford but hoping a well-chosen husband might change her fate. All the while, peasant girls might be grumbling about being sold off, too young, eager for a sliver of independence but caught in the gears of necessity. Despite all this structure, clever women occasionally found ways to bend the rules. A widow might marry again, this time for love. A nun might escape her vows and elope. A noblewoman might manipulate correspondence between lords to engineer the match she wanted all along. These weren't the norm, but they weren't unheard of either. And every story like that carved a small notch into the greater system, making it a little less rigid, a little more human. So, you trace these patterns through the marketplace, stitched not just in gold and linen, but in stories and strategy, in whispered ambitions and bold gambles. This wasn't just a system of transactions. It was a living web of class, gender, and survival, with every thread tugging on another. And the girls? They stepped into this world cautiously, sometimes excited, often afraid, almost always uncertain. But through their choices, however limited, however quiet, they shaped the market as much as the market shaped them. Remember this tangled web. You'll see its pattern again and again, woven into every future negotiation and sewn quietly into the sleeves of every gown. The marketplace is quieter now, the laughter and haggling fading into the background as your mind drifts toward a shaded corner where something softer stirs, ritual, tradition, and the quiet poetry of local custom. While the grand stage of medieval marriage might be dominated by dowries, alliances, and contracts, there were corners of the world where things unfolded with charming oddity, sweet superstition, and the kind of community theater that made even the most calculated unions feel strangely human. You might picture a small village nestled in the folds of the Alps, where a bride's family gathers not to talk numbers, but to stir honey into a copper bowl. They're baking the marriage cake, a thick, herb-laced loaf with sprigs of rosemary for fidelity, fennel for courage, and a whisper of cinnamon for warmth. When it's done, it's not sliced and served, but carried solemnly to the groom's household. A fragrant offering that says, "We give her sweetly and with hope." You can almost taste the earthy sweetness as it's shared by candlelight, the air filled with the heavy scent of bread, beeswax, and maybe a little nervous sweat. In other towns, things weren't quite so cozy. Take a custom from parts of England, where a marriage could begin with a groom kidnapping his bride. Don't worry, this wasn't always the stuff of nightmares. In many cases, it was a carefully choreographed performance, more mischievous than malicious. The bride might know full well what was coming, and even play along, squealing as she was stolen from her home and carted off dramatically to her new one. Historians still debate how much agency women really had in these moments. Was it cheeky ritual or sanctioned mischief? Was she really consenting, or simply following the script handed down through generations? There are no easy answers. What's clear is that these performances allowed communities to acknowledge the bittersweet moment when a girl left her childhood behind, and to make that departure something unforgettable. It might make you chuckle, imagining the chaos, the groom's friends whooping with laughter, the bride's younger siblings tagging along like it's the best parade of the year, the villagers gossiping with good-natured glee. For one moment, the transaction becomes a tale, something to be retold at firesides long after the guests have gone home. In coastal Mediterranean towns, things looked different again. Here, couples would wear simple rings of iron or braided hair, humble, handmade tokens of commitment long before the wedding day. These weren't mere placeholders. They were public statements, signaling to everyone in the market square or village well that the wheels of union were in motion. Imagine passing a young woman at a vendor's stall, her hand briefly lifting a basket to reveal a fine braid of dark hair wrapped around her finger. The message was subtle but clear: she was spoken for. These tokens weren't just romantic. Though there's a lovely intimacy in wearing someone else's hair on your hand, they were deeply practical too. They helped stave off unwanted suitors, discouraged rivals, and gave both families time to arrange the serious matters of money, land, and obligations. These slow-moving engagements could last weeks or months. But rather than dragging on in tedium, they created space, what you might call a social exhale. Time for excitement to build, for younger siblings to adjust to the idea, for gossip to burn itself out and goodwill to settle in. In a world where lives could shift overnight due to politics or misfortune, this deliberate pacing offered a rare kind of emotional buffer. And not all customs were about the couple alone. In many Germanic towns, betrothals were sealed with a community meal. Picture it: long benches set under apple trees, pitchers of ale, hearty bread torn and shared with neighbors who all had a stake in the match. Marriage, after all, wasn't just between two people, it was between farms, guilds, entire bloodlines. These communal feasts were less about romance than social glue. They let everyone weigh in, offer blessings, and, if needed, air their grievances before things became irreversible. You might even find yourself smiling at a tradition from Hungary, where the bride's shoes were stolen during the reception and auctioned back to the highest bidder, usually the groom. A cheeky little fundraiser, sure, but also a symbolic moment where the husband literally invested in his bride's future comfort. Practical, performative, and just slightly absurd, exactly what medieval ritual did best. And then, there were rituals designed to ward off bad luck. In parts of the Balkans, brides would be lightly smudged with soot or ash before stepping into their new home, a gesture meant to confuse jealous spirits who might follow her. You might wince at the thought of soot on a clean veil, but the symbolism is oddly beautiful. Before joy, a little darkness. Before light, a flicker of shadow. These quiet corners of the marriage market remind you that tradition often works not to enforce power, but to humanize it. When a girl is led from her home with laughter, when she receives a loaf of herb bread instead of a coin, when she wears her beloved's hair like armor, it softens the edges of a world that was otherwise hard, fast, and rarely fair. Historians still puzzle over how these customs spread. Were they passed along trade routes? Born from local superstition? Imposed by clergy? Or invented by grandmothers with a flair for drama? The answer, most likely, is all of the above. Rituals, like rivers, flow where they're needed. And as you return now to the center of the marriage market, the loud voices and clinking coins feel different. Less transactional, more theatrical. You've seen what lives just beneath the surface. The cake still warm from the hearth, the braided ring on a nervous finger, the laughter echoing down the lane as a kidnapped bride grins behind her veil. These traditions, however peculiar they may seem to modern eyes, did more than fill time. They built bridges between families, between past and future, and between the business of marriage and the very human hearts caught inside it. You drift now into the fascinating realm of consent and refusal, a topic that complicates the simple image of the medieval marriage market as a straightforward trade. While it's easy to imagine girls being handed off like parcels wrapped in dowry cloth and family expectation, the truth, as always, is messier. Beneath the surface, this system pulsed with subtle negotiations, veiled resistance, and quiet moments of defiance that rippled through households and whole communities. Now, let's not get too modern with our lens. Consent in the medieval world wasn't what we understand it to be today. There were no signature forms, no explicit "I do" with informed autonomy behind it, but it also wasn't completely absent. Particularly among the higher status families, a daughter's preference could hold surprising sway, especially if rejecting a suitor could be finessed as a matter of strategy rather than rebellion. Picture a girl in a noble household, say 15 or 16 years old, sitting under the eye of a chaperone while her parents discuss her future like horse traders. She's not shouting, "I refuse," across the long dining hall, but perhaps she turns her face slightly, avoids eye contact when her suitor visits, or murmurs that she dreams of the convent life instead. Maybe she's suddenly overcome with mysterious headaches every time a particular name is mentioned. Her voice isn't loud, but it's there, soft, coded, and insistent. Historians still debate how often these refusals genuinely worked versus how often they were absorbed back into the tide of family expectation. Outright defiance was risky. For most young women, especially those in tightly bound noble lineages, it could mean disgrace, confinement, or worse. But nuanced refusal? That had room to breathe. You can imagine the delicate art of delay, mothers staging illnesses, fathers grumbling about dowry shortfalls, families suddenly finding the season too unsettled for a wedding. These weren't always acts of rebellion. Sometimes they were polite ways to say, "No, thank you," without rupturing the fragile threads holding social alliances together. It was a dance, slow, deliberate, and conducted to the rhythm of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. In some communities, particularly rural or less formally governed areas, betrothals weren't considered truly binding until they were either consummated or confirmed in a public ceremony. These informal engagements functioned as a kind of probation period, and during that interlude, there was room to change one's mind, though preferably without making too much noise about it. You might grin at the thought of a young woman feigning sudden religious fervor, claiming she'd had a vision from a saint instructing her to stay single until next harvest. Or a young man dragging his feet, always conveniently out of town when meetings were arranged, perhaps taking an unusually strong interest in the monastery's brewing techniques. Rumors and reputations were powerful currencies. A single hint that a girl was unwilling or a young man disinterested could derail negotiations faster than a missing dowry. And once word spread, it moved fast. You can almost hear the creak of the tavern door, the pause in the baker's gossip, the curious look exchanged between two aunts over their sewing. "Have you heard? She's refused him again." These little murmurs could inflate into full-blown obstacles, sometimes dooming a match entirely. That's not to say everyone had room to maneuver. Peasant families, for instance, were often far more constrained by necessity. A daughter's marriage could mean one less mouth to feed, or a modest alliance that might keep their fields secure for another generation. But even there, small acts of resistance crept in. There are accounts, scattered, rare, but intriguing, of village girls who ran away rather than marry a man they found repugnant. Sometimes they returned and were forgiven. Sometimes they didn't return at all. Interestingly, church law played a curious double role here. While the institution usually backed arranged marriages and enforced marital contracts, canon law also insisted that marriage required the free consent of both parties. This created a legal gray zone that occasionally worked in favor of a reluctant bride or groom. In court cases, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries, a surprising number of annulments were granted on the basis of coerced consent or secret pre-contracts. So yes, even in a world run by patriarchs and property, the flicker of personal will mattered, at least sometimes. And oh, the pre-contracts. They could be a lifesaver or a scandal, depending on when and how they were discovered. If a young woman had previously promised herself, however informally, to another man, and it could be proved, that was grounds to halt a new marriage. Occasionally, these contracts were genuine declarations of love. Sometimes they were strategic loopholes, forged just in time to stop an unwanted union. Either way, they reflect a kind of agency, a way of shaping one's fate from inside the maze. You might smile at the strange ingenuity people used to reclaim a bit of control. In some regions, marriage by abduction was practiced, where a couple would arrange a staged kidnapping to sidestep parental opposition and force the issue before community leaders. It was a risky tactic, but if they made it to the altar first, the union was often deemed valid. Not exactly a fairy tale elopement, but it worked. So as you continue to wander through the dusty alleys of this medieval marketplace, try not to see every girl as a voiceless pawn on a family chessboard. True, the rules were rigid, the stakes high, and the penalties for stepping out of line could be severe. But tucked inside that framework were countless little acts of rebellion and persuasion, small negotiations wrapped in ritual and silence. A glance here, a delay there, a headache, a vision, a politely withheld answer. In these hushed refusals and subtle reshufflings, the human heart asserted itself, not loudly, not always successfully, but often enough to leave its trace in the records and stories that have drifted down to us. You can almost hear them, those whispered, "no thank yous," echoing faintly beneath the clatter of coins and the rustle of contract parchment. So while you trudge on through this vibrant and chaotic bazaar of marriages, remember that not all trades were completed, and not every bride was entirely without choice. Sometimes, resistance wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It flickered quietly, like candlelight behind a thick velvet curtain. Section 11. As the market hums around you, your attention shifts toward a quieter, more strategic layer of activity, not the clinking of coins or rustling of fabric, but the carefully calculated moves behind each marriage match. Here, families are not merely marrying off daughters and sons for the sake of the moment. No, what unfolds is a generational game, a long-view strategy in which one well-placed wedding could ripple through decades, shaping family fortunes, social standing, and even political borders. You imagine yourself seated at the edge of a great hall, thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the low murmur of deliberation. This isn't a lavish wedding feast. It's the prelude, the behind-the-scenes plotting. At the high table, an aging baron negotiates with the father of a would-be bride. Their voices are low, but their intentions are bold. To forge not just a union of two people, but an alliance that will extend across generations, binding estates, loyalties, and bloodlines. Historians still argue whether these far-sighted matches were motivated more by sheer survival, securing land, manpower, and safety, or by aspirational social climbing. But really it was both. A single strategic marriage could extinguish a generations-old feud or gain access to valuable grazing lands, trade routes, or even the ear of a local ruler. Families, particularly those of the gentry or aspiring merchant class, treated marriage as a long-term investment, one that could yield influence well beyond the wedding day. You might chuckle, thinking of these arrangements as medieval mergers and acquisitions. No spreadsheets or stock options, just hand-copied ledgers, whispered agreements, and the weighty silence of family elders nodding solemnly at the terms. Still, the goal was the same: build resilience, gain leverage, and ideally come out ahead of your rivals, preferably without needing a single sword raised. The heart of these alliances was the marriage contract, a document that often ran longer than the ceremony itself. These weren't just poetic declarations of love and fidelity, they were legally binding agreements, outlining the dowry to be delivered, the bride's property rights, and obligations of both spouses. You can picture a weary scribe squinting by candlelight, slowly dipping a quill and carefully inscribing clauses about vineyards, livestock, and land boundaries. Every phrase mattered, as families might use this parchment to settle future disputes or claim inheritances. In some regions, these contracts even spelled out expectations for behavior. A nobleman in 13th century Provence, for instance, might insist that his future son-in-law not only provide a certain amount of wool annually but also refrain from gambling or consorting with local tavern wenches. One can only imagine the side eyes cast during such clauses. Was that aimed at Uncle Bernard, who accidentally bet the family mule last summer? Oddly modern, too, were the stipulations regarding children. How many were expected, by when, and what inheritance structures would apply if tragedy struck early. These fine print details reveal a world where personal lives were not private, but publicly negotiated and enforced through shared memory and legalese. And once one marriage succeeded in its strategic aims, families rarely stopped there. They often arranged additional matches within the same trusted social circles, strengthening ties and building what scholars call marriage networks. Think of it like medieval LinkedIn, but instead of endorsement buttons, you had godparent arrangements and collective dowry contributions. The more intertwined your family was with others, the safer and more respected your name became. You might picture a silver-haired matriarch presiding over this intricate web of matches like a chess master, murmuring to herself as she surveys which cousin might be a good fit for the neighbor's widowed son, or whether the baker's ambitious daughter could be paired with a merchant's youngest to secure a better supply of grain. She isn't just matchmaking, she's future-proofing the family name. In some cases, the ripple effect stretched astonishingly far. A daughter married into a merchant family, who married into minor nobility, whose grandson might one day wear a crown. Entire dynasties were built from carefully tended alliances that began with little more than shared borders and mutual economic interests. And of course, not every match went smoothly. Alliances faltered. Promised dowries didn't arrive on time, or a family's political position soured before the ink dried. In these cases, the contract served as both shield and sword, giving spurned parties recourse to the courts, an expensive, drawn-out process that could still be preferable to outright feuding. Some families even crafted fallback plans. If your daughter dies before consummation, we'll marry the younger sister, or, should the groom lose his land in a border dispute, a re-evaluation of dowry obligations shall be permitted. These clauses sound cold now, but at the time, they were simply practical hedges against misfortune in a world where famine, war, and disease could upend lives overnight. In particularly close-knit communities, this interconnectedness became both a strength and a headache. Everyone was related to everyone else by some degree, which occasionally forced couples to seek dispensation from the church for consanguinity, the dreaded, too closely related clause. But in most cases, such ties just reinforced social cohesion. It's much harder to start a feud with the neighboring village if 3 of your nieces are married there and your eldest son's godmother lives down the road. Even the peasants, often left out of historical records, participated in their own versions of long-term marriage strategies. A field laborer's daughter marrying a miller's son might seem humble, but the access to flour, tools, and seasonal labor it provided could lift a family's standing for a generation. So now, as you walk through this part of the market, you see the marriage not as an isolated event but a thread in a great woven tapestry, a pattern passed down, revised, and embellished with every generation. Families moved through time not with declarations or speeches, but with matches sealed in quiet rooms, far from the dance floor or the altar. Behind every loving couple, there were whispered conversations, weighing pros and cons like gold on a scale. Behind every wedding feast, a ledger full of names and numbers, of hopes cast forward like seeds. And behind every marriage that lasted, a quiet belief that through alliance, whether forged from love, necessity, or ambition, people could build something more enduring than any one life alone. As the market's clamor continues, you begin to notice a recurring theme whispered between gossiping matrons and sharply dressed merchants alike. The dowry. It drifts like incense through the air, fragrant with significance, far more than just a bag of coins or a few rolls of cloth. No, this isn't merely a transaction. It's a whole language, carefully crafted and deeply layered, a form of negotiation that speaks volumes about love, status, and security in the medieval world. You find yourself imagining a bride's dowry chest, hand-carved, maybe a little scuffed from its journey, but packed with intent. Linens folded with care. Jewelry passed down from grandmothers. A pair of goats, small but reliable. Maybe even a few silver coins sewn into the hem of a wedding shift, just in case. Every item tells a story, not just of wealth, but of preparation, of a family doing everything it can to ensure its daughter enters marriage with dignity and bargaining power. Dowries were, at their core, a gift from the bride's family to the groom, or, more accurately, to the household the couple was forming. But like many gifts in medieval society, they came with strings, expectations, and implications. It wasn't just, here's a nice blanket and a chicken. It was more like, we are investing in this union, and we expect it to last, prosper, and elevate us all. The size and contents of a dowry could vary enormously depending on geography, class, and local custom. In a Tuscan merchant town, a dowry might include bolts of fine silk or a plot of vineyard land. In rural Poland, it might be 2 pigs, some hand-woven rugs, and a milk cow named Berta. In England, a middling gentry girl's dowry could include a feather bed, a brass pot, a small sum of money, and a couple of silver spoons, the family silver, quite literally. Historians still debate how empowering dowries really were for women. On the one hand, a large dowry gave a bride leverage. It might secure her a better match, earn her more respect in her husband's household, or even guarantee her some degree of financial independence. Some cities, like Venice and Florence, developed intricate legal systems to protect a woman's dowry, ensuring it couldn't just be squandered by her new husband on dice games and ale. On the other hand, dowries also framed women as economic units. The phrase, marrying well, didn't just mean finding someone kind or witty, it meant matching dowry to opportunity, like a very well-dressed business deal. Brides were evaluated as much for what they brought in goods as for what they brought in personality. It's like trying to negotiate a job contract where your resume includes 1 horse and 3 sheep. Still, in many places, dowries acted as a form of insurance. If a husband died, or if the marriage fell apart, in the rare cases where that was even legally possible, a portion of the dowry might be returned to the wife or her family. This meant that families negotiated dowries with care, often specifying exact terms. What would be given, how it would be used, and what would happen to it in case of misfortune. Contracts could be dozens of pages long, the medieval equivalent of prenups, written with ink, wax seals, and occasionally thinly veiled threats. You can almost picture a mother stuffing an extra ribbon or silver clasp into the dowry chest at the last minute, whispering to herself, "This'll show those Harringtons down the road." Even among peasants, these contributions were no small matter. That extra hen might mean eggs through winter. A wool shawl could be warmth on a frost-bitten night, or proof that the bride came from a family that planned ahead. In noble circles, dowry competition was an art form. Families went into debt to provide lavish dowries, betting on political alliances and future favors. If the bride was noble enough, even kings got involved. Isabella of Portugal's dowry to Philip the Good of Burgundy included jewels, gold, and 200,000 gold coins, enough to fund several wars or at least a few really extravagant tournaments. But dowries didn't always go as planned. Some families couldn't deliver on their promises, sparking legal battles or broken engagements. Others gave too much and found themselves financially ruined. There were even dowry frauds, counterfeit coins, false claims of property, or items substituted at the last minute. One can only imagine the scandal when a promised bolt of silk turned out to be cleverly disguised linen. Sometimes, dowries included more than goods. They could come with stipulations, like housing rights for a bride's aging father or a guarantee that her younger brother would be apprenticed to the groom. In this way, dowries weren't just about the couple, they were about entire families merging, negotiating a shared future. And let's not forget the drama. Quiet rivalries brewed among neighbors trying to outdowry each other. A cousin might accidentally mention that her daughter's dowry included imported spices. A local merchant might inflate the value of his daughter's goods, knowing full well the community would gossip for weeks. You might chuckle imagining two matriarchs glaring across the village green, mentally tallying up cows and copper pots. There's a darker edge too. In some regions, girls who couldn't provide a dowry were effectively unmarriageable regardless of their character or beauty. Some ended up in convents, not always by choice, because their families couldn't afford to make a match. The dowry, while often a source of pride and protection, could also be a gatekeeper, locking doors instead of opening them. In certain communities, creative solutions emerged. Group dowries were pooled to help poorer girls marry. Brotherhoods and guilds sometimes stepped in to sponsor promising matches. And in a few rare instances, love did conquer economics, though those stories were usually the exception, not the rule. So, remember that chest of goods. Not just a box of things, but a time capsule filled with hope, anxiety, social maneuvering, and centuries of tradition. Every jar of honey, every wool blanket, every thread of embroidery carried meaning beyond its material worth. It told the world, we've prepared, we've planned, we've loved her enough to give her a future. And in the slow rhythm of the marketplace, where families measured worth in cattle and coin, in silk and smiles, that chest was everything. It was promise. It was possibility. It was power, tucked neatly into linen folds and leather straps, waiting for the right door to open. The marketplace's buzz shifts now, not toward bargaining, not toward dowries or contracts, but to the culmination of it all, the marriage ceremony itself. A curious blend of solemnity and revelry, practicality and symbolism. You step forward into a scene where two people are about to be joined, not just in name or property, but in a performance witnessed, judged, and celebrated by their entire community. Unlike the long, lace-trimmed processions we might associate with modern weddings, medieval ceremonies could be shockingly short. In many regions and periods, a legally binding marriage required nothing more than mutual consent, spoken aloud in present tense, what scholars call words of the present. No priest necessary, no gold band slipped over trembling fingers. Sometimes the magic words were whispered in a church porch or mumbled over bread in a family kitchen. You can almost feel the damp stone beneath your shoes as you stand in the doorway of a small village church, listening as a young couple repeats simple vows. No fanfare, no violin quartet, just a couple of friends or relatives nodding in approval. One handshake, one phrase, and the course of two lives is changed forever. Historians still debate whether these ceremonies were truly the linchpin of marriage, or if the real binding agents were the written contracts, the exchanged property, or even the consummation afterward. In fact, in some legal traditions, physical intimacy itself could retroactively validate a marriage that had no ceremony at all. This leads to some very awkward hypothetical legal questions, ones that church courts spent a great deal of time puzzling through. But when there was a ceremony, it could be a spectacle. Royal weddings, for example, were lavish affairs, part propaganda, part theatrical production. The ceremony might last an entire day, followed by a feast that dragged on for 3. Trumpets blared, bells rang, courtiers paraded in velvet and gold. Imagine the rich scent of roasted game birds drifting from a banquet hall, while dancers spun in intricate patterns and poets recited verses glorifying the union as a cosmic event. And yet, even in simpler weddings, there was always a sense of occasion. Local customs colored each ceremony with personality. In parts of Scandinavia, the groom might carry the bride across the threshold of their new home, not just to show off his strength, but to keep lurking spirits at bay. In Germany, neighbors might set off small fireworks or bang pots to ward off bad luck, and possibly just to have a bit of fun. In rural Italy, families threw rice or barley over the couple, grains, ancient symbols of fertility and prosperity. You can almost hear the soft patter as the seeds bounce off cloaks and cobblestones, while elders nod approvingly and children scramble to scoop them up like treasure. And then there were the clothes. You might be surprised to learn that the color white, now synonymous with bridal purity, had little to do with medieval wedding attire. In fact, white was considered impractical and sometimes even funereal. A noble bride might wear deep crimson silk or shimmering green velvet, colors meant to display family wealth and the richness of the household she came from. Black, too, wasn't unheard of, less a mark of mourning and more a symbol of formality or status. Picture her cloak, heavy with embroidery, its hem weighted with tiny bells or pearls, perhaps stitched with family crests. No minimalist satin slips here. Every thread was a symbol, every brooch a message. We are a family of means. This union matters. And don't forget the hair. Braided, veiled, jeweled, sometimes all at once. A noblewoman might have a crown of flowers, or even a gold circlet, delicately hammered into a shape that told you more about her lineage than any conversation could. The marriage night itself, that was often less private than we'd expect. In many communities, it was followed by several days of feasting, where the entire village joined in. Music, dancing, storytelling, rituals designed not only to celebrate, but to reinforce social bonds. A wedding was a public affair because marriage was public business. It was the glue holding households, economies, and inheritance together. You might chuckle at the idea of a bride trying to maintain some composure while a local bard belts out a slightly too risque tale about Venus and a wayward knight, or an old auntie pokes the groom's ribs with a knowing wink. In some places, the couple would even be paraded through the town in bedclothes, or at least symbolically led to their chambers, while villagers sang cheeky songs. One part blessing, one part embarrassment, and maybe one part mild revenge for all the noise and fuss. Some of these post-ceremony parties blurred the line between festivity and obligation. Families were expected to host, feed, and entertain everyone from local priests to grumpy neighbors. This could be ruinously expensive, especially for families trying to show off just a little more prosperity than they actually had. Still, these feasts served a purpose. They weren't just about merrymaking, they were acts of social confirmation. When a marriage was celebrated publicly, it was much harder to dispute later. We saw them wed, someone might say decades down the line in a property squabble. We danced at the feast and drank the honeyed wine. All of these traditions, whether a hurried handshake or a week-long royal affair, transformed the abstract idea of alliance into something tactile. Every gesture, every spoken vow, every bite of food or clatter of grain against stones stitched together a communal understanding. This marriage is real, this couple is recognized, this household is part of us. So as you settle into the gentle rhythm of the marketplace's closing ceremonies, let yourself drift through these images. A bride's cloak catching the sunlight. A groom nervously brushing crumbs from his tunic. Laughter and candlelight echoing off stone walls. A little girl in the crowd imagining her own wedding someday, her feet still bare, her eyes wide with wonder. In these ceremonies, there was more than tradition at play. There was hope. There was trust. There was a strange, enduring belief that two people, brought together through negotiation and planning, could still find something resembling joy. And sometimes, despite everything they did. As the market noise softens and your footsteps slow, the energy of bargaining and bright fabric stalls fades into something more intimate, more hushed. You're no longer in the thick of the transaction. The match has been made, the dowry agreed, the ceremonies completed. Now comes the quieter, messier reality, life after marriage. You step into the modest threshold of a new home, your new life folding around you like a well-worn cloak that doesn't quite fit yet. You're a young bride, perhaps 13, maybe 15 if you're lucky, carrying your trousseau in a small chest, a few linens, some modest jewelry, maybe even a prayer book if your family had coin to spare. You're escorted to your husband's household, which might already feel like a tiny village of its own. It's not just your new husband awaiting you, but possibly his parents, his siblings, servants bustling through narrow hallways, and animals bleating somewhere far too close for your liking. The space smells of damp wood, onion stew, and damp wool cloaks drying near the hearth. Historians still debate how much say you had in shaping your new life once inside those walls. Did you get to choose where the firewood was stored, how the bread was baked, or what time supper was served? Maybe not at first, but slowly, oh so slowly, you would carve out a space for yourself in this foreign world. Women, it seems, had more agency than often assumed, though it came in whispers and glances, not proclamations. You might start by supervising the kitchen or tending the garden. From there, you'd learn the subtle rhythms of managing servants, directing the milkmaid, or quietly advising your husband on household accounts. You picture yourself holding a ledger with trembling hands, learning to track how much wool was spun or how many chickens should be kept for laying versus slaughter. Some women, especially in northern European towns, even owned shops or ran small family businesses. Not everyone was confined to spinning flax and stirring soup. The household might be a small empire, and you, the empress in slippers. You trudge through the house's narrow corridors, brushing against rough stone walls and low-slung beams, learning who sits where at the table, what tasks are expected before sunrise, and when it's best to stay silent. Your mother-in-law, if present, may be a stern figure, the kind who believes in earning respect through quiet obedience and well-salted broth. Or perhaps she's warm and slightly deaf, eager for help darning socks. Every household was a lottery of personalities and expectations. In some parts of Europe, a bride brought a dowry in the form of land, livestock, or even labor contracts. That gave her leverage. In southern France, women could inherit land under certain conditions, and widows were sometimes powerful property holders. Elsewhere, like parts of England or the Holy Roman Empire, laws could limit female property rights, but clever women still found ways to work around them, through family alliances, dower rights, or even by joining religious orders later in life and regaining autonomy. Imagine a young wife who slowly earns the steward's respect, whispering advice about the grain harvest or suggesting a more profitable way to sell the cheese. She's not the head of the household by law, but everyone knows she's the one who keeps it from falling apart. These stories existed, they just didn't always get written down. And then there's the elephant in the marital bedroom. Intimacy, expected, unavoidable, and rarely spoken of outside whispered conversations behind closed shutters. You might dread the wedding night, or you might approach it with curiosity, or maybe just resignation. The church taught that marital intimacy was for procreation, not pleasure, though you can imagine plenty of people nodding solemnly at that sermon and then forgetting it entirely once the candles were blown out. Historians still argue over how much say women had in this deeply personal arena. Laws existed to protect women from abuse, but enforcement was sporadic and culture-specific. Yet many women, especially those with strong family support or good standing in their communities, found ways to navigate this aspect of married life with quiet resolve. Sometimes, they even negotiated arrangements, rituals, timing, privacy, that gave them a bit more control than we might assume. You can almost hear the rustle of a bride's sleeping shift as she lies awake, listening to the creak of the wooden floorboards, wondering whether her new husband snores or speaks in his sleep. In time, the awkwardness would ease, as shared meals and farm chores softened the strangeness between two people who had likely barely spoken before being declared man and wife. Let's not forget the emotional side of this arrangement. Sometimes love grew, slowly and sweetly, like ivy up a stone wall. Other times it didn't. Some couples became loyal companions. Others maintained a cool politeness. And some? Well, they simply lived parallel lives, like two oxen yoked to the same plow but pulling in different directions. Even amid these practical and emotional shifts, there were often little sparks of individuality, small rebellions against the order of things. You might hide a tiny pouch of rose petals beneath your mattress just to remind yourself of home. Or keep a carved spoon from your father, a token that no one else in the house understands but you touch before bed each night. Maybe you sneak moments in the herb garden, where the smell of lavender and thyme allows you to feel, for a breath or two, like yourself again. You might chuckle imagining a bride trying to adjust to her new husband's peculiar habits. Perhaps he talks to his cows or insists on drying his socks near the fire no matter how bad they smell. These quirks became part of the shared life, part of the slow knitting together of two strangers bound by tradition, obligation, and sometimes fondness. It's easy to romanticize the happily ever after, but most medieval marriages weren't fairy tales, they were work. They were negotiations that unfolded not just at the moment of betrothal, but every day after, in kitchens and fields and candlelit rooms. So, as you step back from this quiet threshold of domestic life, remember, the marriage market may have sparked the match, but the true story, the living, breathing, endlessly evolving story, played out here, behind wooden doors, in shared routines and silent resilience. And in those small, soft spaces, history wasn't just written. It was lived. Now, as the marketplace fades into memory, its bright stalls and noisy haggling receding into the quiet of dusk, you begin to notice the softer voices that were always there, just beneath the din, the murmurs about the girls who never married. Not the brides in lace, or the daughters swapped like prized sheep between landowners, but the women who quietly sidestepped the whole business. The so-called old maids of medieval society. You imagine her now, a woman in her late 20s, perhaps even, gasp, her 30s. She keeps her head high as she walks through the village, a wicker basket on her arm, ignoring the sidelong glances from neighbors who wonder why she never married. At a time when marriage was expected to be a woman's destiny, her identity, and her economic plan all rolled into one, staying single could make her both an object of suspicion and a small legend in her own right. Historians still debate how marginalized these women really were. While folklore and moralists of the time often cast the unmarried woman as a figure of pity, or, worse, ridicule, legal records, tax rolls, and town charters tell a more varied story. Some unmarried women owned property, managed small shops, raised siblings, or stepped in as informal community leaders. Not all spinsters were spinning in sorrow. In fact, the word spinster itself comes from the literal act of spinning wool, a task often assigned to unmarried women. It's oddly poetic, isn't it? While others wove themselves into marriage contracts, these women spun their own thread, one humble turn of the wheel at a time. You can almost hear the soft whir of a spindle and the crackle of a small hearth fire as a woman works in peace, no husband to boss her, no mother-in-law lurking with unsolicited advice. Of course, freedom wasn't always accompanied by comfort. Without a husband's name or income, many unmarried women faced financial precarity. They often lived with relatives, sometimes welcome, sometimes not, or in tiny rented quarters on the edge of town. Some found seasonal work in fields or households. Others survived on church charity or community goodwill. It was a quiet kind of resilience, made from scraps and routine, not glory. You might smile at the idea of a particularly headstrong woman deflecting every match thrown her way, insisting she preferred the smell of her own kitchen to a stranger's expectations. Somewhere in that village, you can hear a well-meaning aunt sighing and muttering, "She'll change her mind. Just wait till winter." But winter comes, and the woman simply adds another log to her fire and hums while kneading bread. In more structured environments, especially in urban centers, unmarried women formed networks of support. Guilds in cities like London, Ghent, and Florence occasionally accepted single women as apprentices or masters, particularly in textiles, brewing, and midwifery. Some women even banded together, living in small, all-female households, pooling their resources and carving out tiny pockets of independence. And then there were the convents. For some women, they were a refuge. For others, a redirection. Entering religious life offered structure, safety, and social respect, if not always choice. Sometimes a girl was gifted to the church as a baby. Sometimes, after the death of a husband or parent, she chose the veil over remarriage. Convents were far from drab cloisters. They were centers of literacy, music, healing, and hospitality. Within those stone walls, women wrote, taught, gardened, and prayed, often living lives that rivaled or surpassed their married sisters in autonomy and impact. You picture a nun bent over an illuminated manuscript, her fingers stained with ink, copying ancient texts while the world outside marches to the beat of marriage bells. Her silence is not empty, it hums with purpose. Yet not all unmarried women found peace in solitude or religious devotion. The social pressure to marry was immense, and failure to do so could lead to gossip, isolation, or worse. In some places, unmarried women were grouped into legal categories that limited their rights or barred them from owning property. Their marginality could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, less security leading to less opportunity, and on it went. And then there's the folklore. From Shakespeare's thorny old maid jokes to medieval sermons warning women not to die unloved, or worse, unmothered, the unmarried woman became a canvas for society's anxieties. Yet even this trope had variations. In some tales, the clever, unmarried aunt outwits greedy in-laws. In others, the village healer, always a little strange, always single, knows the names of every herb and every baby born in the last 50 years. You might chuckle imagining a local matchmaker throwing up her hands in exasperation, muttering, "She turned down the butcher, the cooper, and that traveling scribe. There's no helping her." And the woman, with a sly grin, goes back to her herb garden. These women remind you that the medieval marriage market wasn't a one-size-fits-all affair. For every bride led down the aisle, there were women who walked other roads, some paved in hardship, others in choice. Some stood alone in defiance, others formed quiet alliances of care and companionship. All of them lived within a system but not always defined by it. Their lives might not appear in love poems or stained glass windows, but they shaped the rhythm of medieval life in quieter, steadier ways. They stitched clothes, kept ledgers, mentored nieces, brewed ale, and tended to dying neighbors. In their absence from the marriage market, they created space for a different kind of presence, one that history is only beginning to fully appreciate. So as the sun sets on the marriage market and its colorful chaos, spare a thought for the women who stood just outside the stalls, watching with wry amusement or distant sadness. They may not have worn veils or rings, but they carried their own kind of dignity, less celebrated perhaps, but no less profound. The market's echoes now lead you to the peculiar and often overlooked role of matchmakers, the human algorithms of medieval matchmaking who wove together families, fortunes, and futures with a keen sense of social calculus and a pinch of gossip. Imagine it, a sharp-eyed older woman wrapped in wool, clutching a basket that's less about food and more about news. She moves briskly between households, her feet used to cobbled streets and uneven paths, her ears always tuned for whispers and rumors. She's not just carrying messages, she's assessing dowries, inspecting family tempers, and mentally cataloging every eligible child in the parish like she's curating a very fragile art gallery. Matchmakers came in many forms. Some were seasoned professionals, people whose names alone carried weight. Others were more casual, often family friends or older widows, quietly stepping into the role with no ceremony but plenty of savvy. And make no mistake, this wasn't just about love. In fact, love was often a side note. This was about property, lineage, politics, and respectability. And someone had to manage the emotional chaos of that without letting it show. You can almost hear her voice now, gentle, slightly amused, always composed, as she diplomatically describes a bride-to-be's sturdy constitution, when what she means is, well, not exactly elegant. Or the way she calls a groom quiet and focused, which might suggest he hasn't spoken since Pentecost. Euphemism was her second language, and she spoke it fluently. Historians still debate the true extent of the matchmaker's power. Were they merely messengers, carrying one family's intentions to another like couriers of the heart? Or did they act as real influencers, shaping unions that could decide land holdings, inheritance disputes, and even regional power balances? Evidence suggests it was a bit of both. In rural areas, matchmakers often wielded enormous sway. especially if they had longevity and a reputation for successful, scandal-free pairings. You might smile picturing one of them in her element, seated in the kitchen of a nervous mother, sipping broth slowly while listening intently to every anxious detail. She asks questions you wouldn't think of. How many chickens does the family keep? Do they sing too loud at church? Was the grandmother kind or critical? This wasn't idle chat, it was data collection, medieval style. Sometimes, these women operated within clearly defined cultural systems. In Jewish, Muslim, and certain Eastern Orthodox communities, for example, the matchmaker, or shadchan, held an officially recognized role. There were even written contracts and formal agreements, like mini resumes for potential spouses. In some areas of Asia and North Africa, matchmaking evolved into an almost bureaucratic system, complete with binders, dossiers, and local gossip, all organized for maximum efficiency. Other times, the matchmaker was simply the best-connected busybody in town, the aunt who knew everyone's business and didn't mind orchestrating a romance or two along the way. She might not receive money, but gifts were common. A few eggs, a bolt of cloth, a helping hand come harvest time. The real currency, though, was trust. A well-connected matchmaker could make or break reputations, and a single misjudged pairing might mean she'd never be welcomed at the market again. You might chuckle imagining her stuck between a stubborn father who wants his daughter married off by Michaelmas and a love-struck suitor who can't offer anything but a flock of geese and a homemade lute. She listens, she smiles, and then somehow, miraculously, she finds a third option no one saw coming. This was less about magic and more about social calculus, an artful balancing act of personality, property, and local politics. Some matchmakers kept what you could call early genealogical records. Nothing fancy, just personal notes or mental maps of who had married whom, who had quarrels with which family, who had recently come into an inheritance, and who had a brother they weren't speaking to anymore. Over time, these loose webs of information helped prevent embarrassing blunders like accidentally marrying first cousins or aligning with a family currently embroiled in a goat theft scandal. You can imagine the satisfaction they must have felt seeing two people, barely acquaintances a month ago, now wed, trading shy glances at the feast while the matchmaker sips her wine and quietly pats herself on the back. Or maybe she's already thinking ahead to the next match, the next haggled dowry, the next carefully phrased description that turns a willful girl into spirited, or a reclusive man into thoughtful and reserved. Sometimes, though, it didn't go as planned. There were heartbreaks, broken promises, even full-blown feuds sparked by a failed match. When that happened, the matchmaker might be called back to patch things up, or, more awkwardly, to explain herself. And yet, despite these occasional pitfalls, she remained a cornerstone of social stability in many communities. Her work, after all, wasn't just transactional. It was relational, emotional, deeply personal, and remarkably effective. Oddly enough, the matchmaker's influence extended beyond the households directly involved. A well-made match could bring peace between feuding families, reinforce alliances between villages, or boost the local economy with a lavish wedding celebration. A bad match could do the opposite, souring relationships for years. In that way, she functioned almost like a civic planner, shaping not just love stories but the social fabric itself. So now, as you wander this quieter part of the marketplace, picture her again, our unnamed orchestrator in homespun clothes, whispering advice, reading the room, tying invisible strings between people who may not yet know they're being drawn together. She's not always thanked. She's rarely praised in the village chronicles. But she is essential, and she knows it. And what does that say about medieval marriage? That it was not merely a contract or a custom, but a delicate performance, rehearsed and guided by those who knew the script by heart. Behind every public vow, there were whispered negotiations, trial balloons floated in kitchens, and delicate nudges from someone who understood that matchmaking wasn't just an occupation, it was an art. As you wander deeper into the winding lanes of the medieval marriage market, your attention turns to a lesser-known but fascinating corner of this social tapestry: children born before marriage. These little-known, pre-contract offspring added an unexpected and delicate layer of complexity to unions carefully negotiated by families, merchants, and matchmakers alike. Picture this: a young girl, barely out of childhood herself, now a mother to a child conceived before the wedding bells officially rang. Contrary to the tidy arrangements you might expect, such situations were not uncommon. They often sparked delicate negotiations, balancing questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and family honor in ways that could make or break reputations. The neat bartering and arranging of marriages wasn't always neat at all. Historians still debate how strictly medieval communities enforced the timing of marriage and childbirth, but what's clear is that these pre-contract children, sometimes called bastards, in harsh terms, occupied ambiguous social spaces. In some families and locales, they were recognized, cared for, and even integrated into inheritance plans. In others, they were quietly hidden away, their existence a hush-hush secret best kept out of sight. Imagine the awkward conversations between families. On one side, a sense of shame mixed with practical worry: how to legitimize this child without shaming the family or jeopardizing social standing. On the other, a pragmatic realization that life rarely fits the neat boxes families try to create. Would a swift marriage ceremony smooth over everything? Or would this child remain a thorny issue tangled in family relations for years to come? Sometimes the answer was a hasty marriage, arranged quickly to cover over unexpected pregnancies, with families scrambling to preserve appearances. These rushed ceremonies could be a source of tension: a groom suddenly thrust into a role he hadn't anticipated, a bride expected to step into duties before she was ready, and relatives negotiating dowries on the fly. Yet, these imperfect solutions reveal the flexible, living nature of medieval marriage, far from the rigid contracts it's often portrayed as. Interestingly, many medieval legal codes had practical provisions for children born outside formal wedlock. Some laws granted them limited inheritance rights or protections, reflecting a realistic approach to a messy social reality. For example, in some regions, these children could receive a portion of property or be supported by the father, especially if formally acknowledged. This was not universal, though, and in many cases, such children struggled to claim social status or financial support, their futures precarious and uncertain. You might smile at the irony here. Despite all the careful planning and bargaining in the marriage market, the delicate negotiations over dowries, alliances, and social standing, life's unpredictability often forced families to improvise and adapt. The marketplace might have been orderly in theory, but in practice, it was full of messy human stories. Consider, too, how these pre-contract children challenged the neat boundaries of legitimacy that the market sought to enforce. They remind us that medieval marriages were not static contracts, but living agreements, continuously reshaped by the unpredictable flows of real human experience. Sometimes joyful, sometimes awkward, but always compelling in their own right. Picture a young mother holding her child close, aware of the gossip swirling in the market but also fiercely protective of her little one. Imagine the father, perhaps reluctant, perhaps proud, caught between societal expectations and personal feelings. Picture extended family members navigating the tightrope between support and social pressure, their conversations filled with careful words and sidelong glances. As you stroll through this part of the market, you begin to see how these children wove their own quiet stories into the fabric of medieval life. They were the living proof that history is never as tidy as contracts and customs suggest. Instead, it's messy, nuanced, and deeply human, full of surprises that challenge our assumptions and invite a softer, more understanding view of the past. So next time you imagine the medieval marriage market as a neat exchange of goods and promises, remember the little ones who complicated those carefully drawn plans. Their presence, often whispered about or written in the margins of documents, is a reminder that life and love have always resisted the neat boxes society tries to place around them. As you settle deeper into the murmurs of the medieval marketplace, your attention turns to a surprising but pivotal presence: the church. Far from simply officiating weddings with solemn rituals and a few blessings, religious institutions wove themselves tightly into the fabric of medieval marriage. Their influence stretched across legal boundaries, social customs, and emotional lives, shaping not just how marriages began but how they were understood and maintained. Picture a quiet chapel, where a priest in simple robes stands before a couple, holding a book heavy with prayers and laws. His voice is calm and measured as he pronounces them husband and wife. But behind that serene moment lies a vast, intricate web of religious rules and regulations determining who could marry whom, under what circumstances, and with what consequences. At the heart of this were strict rules on consanguinity, that is, how closely related the bride and groom could be. Marriages between close relatives were generally forbidden, but exactly how close was too close wasn't fixed. It shifted depending on time, place, and the ruling church authority. At one point, for example, marriages up to the 7th degree of kinship, which included distant cousins you wouldn't expect, were banned. This made family trees look more like tangled vines than neat charts. You can almost imagine the clerics poring over dusty genealogical scrolls, squinting at faded ink, and debating whether a third cousin twice removed was too close or just distant enough. You might even chuckle picturing these church officials sorting out complicated family histories, their heads full of names like Isolde and Geraint, all to prevent a scandal at the altar. Historians still argue about how strictly these kinship rules were enforced. Some evidence suggests local priests turned a blind eye when convenient, especially for noble families whose alliances were politically important. Others point to cases where dispensations, special permissions to marry despite kinship restrictions, were routinely bought or negotiated, sometimes involving large sums or favors. In that sense, the church wasn't only a gatekeeper but an active participant in the marriage market's intricate dance of power and wealth. Beyond legalities, religious doctrine deeply shaped medieval ideas about what marriage was for. The church taught that marriage had three main purposes: procreation, companionship, and mutual support. This triad wasn't just a checklist. It formed the moral backbone of medieval unions, influencing everything from how families planned for heirs to how spouses were expected to treat each other. Procreation was, of course, paramount. Children ensured family lines, property inheritance, and social stability. Yet, the church also emphasized companionship, encouraging couples to support one another emotionally and spiritually. Mutual support rounded out the ideal, promoting a partnership where husband and wife cared for each other's well-being, though always within the gender roles of the time. In practice, of course, real marriages didn't always match this ideal, but the doctrine provided a guiding light, a moral compass to which couples and communities could return. You might imagine medieval sermons softly reminding congregations about kindness, fidelity, and duty, even as human flaws and ambitions played out in everyday life. Monastic figures, monks, nuns, and priests, often acted as trusted advisors and counselors in these delicate human matters. They helped couples navigate conflicts that might otherwise tear families apart, offering spiritual guidance that blended with practical diplomacy. If a dispute over a dowry or inheritance arose, it wasn't unusual for a local abbot or priest to step in as a mediator, wielding not just religious authority but social influence. Their role was quiet but powerful, shaping marriages not only at the altar but long afterward, as couples struggled with jealousy, misunderstandings, or economic pressures. These religious intermediaries helped hold the fragile social fabric together, a calming presence in a world where marriages were as much contracts as they were unions of hearts. Interestingly, the Church also promoted alternative life paths, especially for women, through vows of celibacy, chastity, or widowhood. Some religious orders welcomed women who chose not to marry, offering them opportunities for education, leadership, and spiritual fulfillment that marriage might have denied. These women often became respected figures in their communities, with a degree of independence rare for the time. Their lives challenged the common assumption that medieval women's only path was marriage and motherhood. Instead, they reveal a broader social tapestry where faith, choice, and tradition interwove in complex ways. As you trace the Church's role through the marketplace's winding lanes, you realize it wasn't just a source of ritual or moralizing. It was a deeply embedded institution, shaping medieval love, law, and life in ways still debated by scholars today. This complexity invites gentle smiles at the quirks of kinship rules, the persistence of human nature within divine frameworks, and the enduring influence of a church that held both hearts and families in its hands. So next time you think of a medieval wedding, remember the layers beneath that simple "I do," a world where sacred laws, human desires, and social necessities all intertwined, quietly guiding each step down the aisle. The market's murmurs shift toward the lives of children born into these arranged marriages, where youth and expectation combined in a unique rite of passage. You can almost hear the soft footsteps of young girls and boys stepping into futures preordained by their families' plans and ambitions. Picture a girl barely into her teens, navigating a world where childhood's end is marked not by a birthday but by a wedding contract signed long before. Early marriages were common, and while the bride might still be growing into her role, the social machinery was already in motion. Historians still debate how much agency these young brides and grooms truly had. Were they passive actors, or did they find ways to assert themselves within tight confines? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with personal stories varying widely by region and circumstance. You might imagine a shy bride, clutching her mother's hand one moment, then bravely facing a household full of strangers the next, learning customs and expectations on the fly. This rapid transition from child to wife or husband could be disorienting, yet often came with a surprising level of support from extended families and communities. Sometimes, marriages were contracted years in advance, with actual cohabitation delayed until both parties reached a more suitable age. These betrothals functioned as social contracts, securing alliances and futures long before the wedding day. You could chuckle picturing negotiations where a father tries to trade a younger daughter for a wealthier son, highlighting the practical, if unromantic, side of these youthful unions. Despite the challenges, many young couples grew into their roles, shaping marriages that blended duty with affection, tradition with personal growth. So, As you wander this part of the marketplace, consider the delicate balance of childhood and adulthood, choice and obligation, a dance repeated across centuries. As the bustling market winds down, your mind lingers on the lasting impact of medieval marriage customs, the invisible threads stretching into today's world. While the medieval marriage market may feel distant, echoes of its practices still ripple through modern traditions, laws, and social expectations. You picture a contemporary wedding, the exchange of rings, the giving away of the bride, even the often awkward small talk among family members. Many of these rituals have roots deep in medieval soil, shaped by centuries of custom, negotiation, and adaptation. Historians still debate exactly how these traditions evolved, but it's clear that the medieval emphasis on alliance, dowry, and community endorsement laid the groundwork for many of today's ceremonies. Even the notion of romantic love as a prerequisite for marriage is a relatively recent invention. You might smile imagining your own wedding through the lens of medieval practices, how the careful bartering of families and fortunes was once front and center, alongside vows and celebrations. It's a reminder that marriage has always been a complex blend of love, duty, and social strategy. Beyond ceremony, the legal frameworks around marriage, property rights, inheritance laws, and divorce restrictions trace back to these medieval negotiations. Some customs that seem quaint or outdated today have deep roots in efforts to manage family wealth and social order. And while modern sensibilities have transformed marriage dramatically, the echoes of that marketplace linger quietly in cultural habits, language, and even popular media. So, as you slowly drift from this medieval marketplace, know that you carry with you a richer understanding of how the past shapes present intimacy, choice, and connection, an enduring story told softly through the ages. Now, as promised, here's a gentle wind down to close our journey. The medieval marriage market may feel like a distant, bustling bazaar, but as the day fades, you notice the quiet rhythms beneath its lively surface. The hopes, fears, and dreams of countless families ripple softly through time like a whispered lullaby. Picture the warm glow of candlelight flickering against stone walls, the gentle murmur of voices settling into night. Let your thoughts drift, easing into a calm awareness of connection. How every choice, every bundle of dowry cloth, every whispered negotiation shaped lives and legacies. The past isn't just a series of events, but a soft thread weaving through us all. Now breathe deeply. Feel the gentle embrace of history's quiet stories wrapping around you like a comforting blanket. With that, you can close your eyes and let sleep carry you gently forward.